Hey, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Matt Hayes for Gryphon. Just want to thank you all for taking the time out of your busy schedules to join us today for our Managing Investigations and Litigation webinar. I know it's kind of the final push to get all your work wrapped up before Thanksgiving holiday, so really appreciate everyone taking a few minutes out of their day. Just a couple of housekeeping items before we dive into it. All the participants are muted. We'll leave about 20 minutes or so at the end for questions and answers from our panelists. So there's a chat box kind of on the GoToWebinar control panel where it says questions. So you could just type in questions there and I'll be able to see them. We could ask that of our panelists. So with that, let's jump right into it. So today we'll kind of explore the case examples of how investigators can be helpful as part of the litigation process, including the use of witnesses and affirmative defenses, human intelligence gathering for complex litigation, and strategies for aligning litigation and investigation's goals. Also explore the relationship between investigators and attorneys and how investigators are leveraged for both the plaintiff and defense teams. And lastly, we'll dive into new and emerging technologies. We'll particularly talk about the use of data and how that's kind of changed the game and how data scientists can really be leveraged to analyze large and complex data sets to identify hidden trends, outliers, and metrics across a variety of different cases. So with that, let me introduce our distinguished group of panelists we have today. I'll start from my left. So we have Chris Harwood, who's our star panelist. He's participated in the second or third webinar for us. Thanks for joining us, Chris. Chris is a former federal prosecutor, and he's a partner with Morvillo Abramowitz right now. His extensive experience includes dozens of investigations, litigations, and settlements involving the False Claims Act, the Bank Secrecy Act, and anti-kickback statute. Chris previously served as Assistant U.S. Attorney in the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Southern District of New York, where he was co-chair of the Civil Frauds Unit. And then to my right is Tom Cowley. Tom's joining us from LA today, so thanks, Tom, for joining us so early in the morning. Tom's the newest member of our Gryphon team. Tom was formerly of Cowley Advisory Group, which is an investigations firm that he started many years ago, which Gryphon just acquired, I guess, about a month ago. Tom has over 35 years of experience conducting complex investigations. In the private sector, he's directed thousands of inquiries involving internal investigations, due diligence, asset searches, and fact gathering in support of commercial litigation in the US, Europe, Latin America, and Asia. Tom was previously an FBI agent where he worked on white collar crime and money laundering investigations before joining Kroll Associates, previously to starting Cowley. And then my colleague, Mary. Mary's our managing director of our data mining and analytics team. Prior to joining Gryphon, Mary worked as a data scientist at the New York State Office of the Attorney General. While there, she provided litigation support for a broad range of subject matters and analytical needs, including financial enforcement, consumer fraud, criminal investigations, and public policy. And last but not least, Jay Dawdy, my boss, president and CEO of Gryphon. Jay has over 20 years of experience in finance, accounting, and investigative work in the US and overseas. He's conducted a wide range of financial and fraud investigations and has worked extensively on due diligence inquiries and litigation support cases. Jay is an old hand at the CLE and CPE approved presentations, giving many seminars and webinars over the years. So thank you all for joining, guys. And let me just start off with kind of the first question about really, in this COVID era, has anything significant changed in the intelligence gathering process during the pandemic, or have your jobs been altered significantly since, this began? And Chris, we'll start off with you.
Sure. So I guess on the intelligence side, I have started to use Zoom. I've embraced the Zoom technology, and I'm, as a lawyer, I rely on Jay, Tom, Meredith, and their teams to do the significant heavy lifting of investigative work. But just in terms of things that I'm able to do myself, reaching out, following up with witnesses, looking to get affidavits or declarations in support of my cases, Zoom has provided a very useful alternative to in-person meetings. Using the share document function, I've been able to share my screen with declarants, walk through draft declarations, make adjustments while talking to the witness, and then through a collaborative process, come up with a final document that can then be transmitted in a socially distanced, appropriate way for our times to the witness to conduct a final review, make any final changes, and execute it. Just an example of the ways that we've been able to roll with the punches a little bit in this COVID era and still get the work done that we need to get done for clients.
Tom, what about you?
Yeah, well, early on, I think it affected our clients a lot more than it did us. With courts were shut down, it seemed like everything just sort of froze. But in terms of our work, it really hasn't affected us much. We're not going to go. We're going to be very selective if we're going to go knock on someone's door and try to talk to them. But there are certain ways where people tend to be home now, so they'll answer the phone amazingly. So it's actually easier to contact people. But and some of the courts have been shut down, so on-site searches are either not happening or you have to make an appointment. It really slows down the process a little bit. A lot of the government buildings and places where we search our archives for various records. But no, overall, it seems like things have really started to get back to normal, especially in the last few months.
Good. And Mary, what about yourself on the data side of things?
Yeah, a lot of what we do is coding. So we're the computer nerds at Gryphon. So our work hasn't changed substantially. You think of, coders as just sort of a solitary person behind a computer screen, and it's actually, we're a pretty collaborative team. So we've had to find, some ways to continue like learning from each other and, learning how to collaborate on code without being able to take over someone's, keyboard. But yeah, I mean, we were pretty well positioned to switch over to, this remote system of work.
Jay, what about yourself across the different practice groups at Gryphon?
Yeah, it hasn't changed too dramatically. We were able to go remote pretty quickly with all the technology that everyone's discussed, and we've been effective, and honestly, people have been more productive since they've been working remotely. We've got a small crew that's back in the office, but 90% of the company is still remote. From an investigative standpoint, not a real significant change. In a litigation context, we do a lot of background investigations, vetting of witnesses, and most of that work was research oriented, so it hasn't changed dramatically. As Tom mentioned, some courts have been difficult to chase down for information. Certain things are hard to confirm these days with people out of the office, employment and education verifications, those types of things. From an interview perspective, we do a lot of interviews as part of the litigation support process. Most of that we started on the phones anyway, pre-COVID, so it didn't really change. I would say, we're not doing a lot of field work these days, and for declarations or meeting witnesses in person, that we're not doing as much of that as Chris mentioned. You can use Zoom for it. We always like to be face-to-face with people. You can always get a better relationship with a person, establish a rapport, potentially, get more information from a person that way. But I think we've adapted pretty well, and the interview process is always much more efficient. We can cover more ground, talk to more people when we're on the phones anyway, and follow it up with either technology or an in-person visit.
Thanks, Jay. Jay, since you went last, you can go first now, but maybe you could just give us some examples of how investigators can be helpful as part of the litigation process, pre-litigation, during litigation, and even after a settlement or judgment.
Sure. Yeah, no, we like to be engaged kind of throughout the process. I think a lot of attorneys that use investigators or data analytics, kind of think of it as a one-off tool, go find this witness, conduct this interview, or conduct this background investigation. But we can really be so much more helpful if we're engaged throughout the process. So in a pre-litigation capacity, we'll work with a lot of attorneys to help vet, whether the case is strong. Before you incur the time and the expense of litigation, you may want to gather additional evidence, talk to people, do some research, and we can help with all those aspects to determine the strength of the case before you go ahead and file, to make sure the facts that you're getting are strong before you go into the litigation. And then also we do a lot of asset investigation work. for the same purpose. You may have a very strong case, but if there's no path to recovery, then it may not make sense to litigate. So, pre-litigation, we can help a lot. During the actual litigation process, that's probably where we do most of our work. It's really more evidence and fact gathering at that point. Everything from witness locates and interviews to declarations, looking for conflicts of interest, doing investigations, vetting expert witnesses, computer forensics, financial investigations. So that's where the bulk of the work that we do comes in. And in post-litigation, we do a lot of asset recovery work, so asset searching. So sometimes the litigation itself is the easy part, but once you've got a judgment, you got to go out and find the assets and enforce, and we can be very helpful in that process. So I think if we're working with attorneys kind of throughout the process, we can help educate them as to how we can help. And I know Mary and I were talking a little bit on the data analytics side. She's done some interesting work, even before cases are filed, and helping identify cases. So I'll pass it to Mary and see what she can tell us about the data analytics side.
Sure. Yeah. I think in the legal world, you often think of data analytics coming in after this discovery process, or after litigation for damages calculations, really common. But we feel like we are most helpful if we get in at the very early stage in the discovery process, so we can help guide. Here's how you can ask for data. Here's the sort of metadata you should ask for. But in particular, when I was at the Attorney General's office, we would get a tip of someone who, maybe was perpetrating a consumer fraud. But we would have to create that data set wholesale from the very beginning. Great example of this was a fake followers case. So it's all about Twitter bots and people whose identities were being copied to make those bots look, like real people. So it all started with an undercover Twitter account and purchasing followers from, a company that we got this tip about, and then using what's called an API, which is basically a way to, write a computer program that'll talk to the backend database of Twitter and start building out from that undercover account these networks of followers that, some of which are going to be bots, some of which are going to be real people, and you need to get a fairly large network to, get an idea of what does a bot look like and how do they look different from a real person. And then, do that same thing to find the identity of the real person who has a real Twitter account that was copied. And how do you tell which one's the real person and which isn't? And that went from, we got a tip and we had no way of getting, the data from the company itself until we filed. And that, that was a really strong case that it was a big New York Times story, got picked up, in a lot of the tech press, and did settle, I think, in 2019 under Letitia James. So it was fun, interesting case. Yeah.
Great, thanks, Mary. Tom or Chris, anything to add?
I was just going to, I would just say that, picking up on what Mary says, that the government is using data. The government uses data all the time in lots of different contexts. And lots of different types of cases. There's been a lot of government investigations in recent years on kickbacks, and particularly what employees of companies are doing with respect to inducements of third parties. In the healthcare context, for example, there have been a number of settlements in recent years focusing on speaker programs where pharmaceutical companies pay a doctor to give an educational talk to a group of other doctors, which is completely fine, so long as there is a legitimate educational purpose to the event. But you've seen settlements of investigations in recent years where the government has gotten admissions in connection with those settlements of groups of doctors attending the same events on the same topics, hearing the same speaker with their same colleagues every week for, every Tuesday dinner at a particular restaurant. And, you can imagine what the data that the government used, how it was useful in identifying those types of arrangements, those types of patterns. And so, I found that in my practice when I was with the government, and now on the private side, helping clients know and what the government's looking for and how they can utilize their own data to protect against an investigation, so that if the government hits them with a subpoena, they've already run the relevant analyses. They've already taken the appropriate mitigating measures. You're in a much better position if you can tell that type of story when the government comes knocking than if you're doing the same analysis at the same time you're giving the data to the government. So I've found data to be, really central to what the government's doing, and then what clients are doing to try to best position themselves in heavily regulated spaces where data is often used.
So maybe we'll start, and shifting gears a little bit. And maybe we'll start off with Chris on this one. How do you think what can investigators do that lawyers can't, or how would they do it differently, perhaps more effectively? Now, I'm not saying lawyers are ineffective, so don't take this.
I would never think you would say that ever. So I think what a real benefit that investigators have is they are not lawyers, so that when the investigators are doing the initial reach out, they are not introducing themselves as, Chris Harwood, a lawyer at Morvillo, Abramowitz, right? I mean, a witness hears that, in response to a cold call, and the guard immediately goes up, like, oh my God, I'm talking to a lawyer. And I think that is, a real initial barrier to being able to build a rapport and have the kind of conversation where one would be able to acquire helpful, frank, straightforward information. And so I've found in my experience that, when I'm looking for witnesses and I need to build groups of witnesses and see if I can, develop that retaining an investigator to perform that initial function is incredibly valuable, because they're able to build a rapport that, given my title, I just can't. Anytime I speak to a witness, I have ethical responsibilities. I have to, be honest. I am honest, and investigators that I retain have to do the same thing. My ethical obligations are imputed to the investigators. That's an important thing for the lawyer and the investigator to know and to discuss, and make sure that the investigator is on the same page as the lawyer as to what the investigator can or can't say in initiating a conversation. But in initiating a conversation, the investigator could say that I'm an investigator working at Gryphon, whereas I would be initiating the conversation as I'm a lawyer working at the firm I work at.
Tom, you want to jump in here and tell us about kind of your experience, obviously?
Yeah, I mean, over the years, we've been asked to do so many things. I mean, obviously, Chris is talking about developing witnesses. It's key. It's just a basic part of what we do. But I think the other thing we're really good at is kind of quickly, efficiently, and cost-effectively getting, background information on opponents, litigants, key witnesses, expert witnesses. We can accumulate a tremendous amount of data, and then if you throw into that social media researches, deep dive social media research, we can bring up all kinds of things that might impact on a witness's credibility, on claims made in a complaint, statements made in deposition, just kind of put people in a time or place where they may or may not have been, or they're claiming to have been. And then, we'll even go on to things like surveillance in trade secrets cases. If somebody setting up a competing business, who's working there, or who are they meeting with? those kinds of things. So those are the things we have a lot of tools, I guess, in the toolkit that I wouldn't see attorneys doing. I don't know, Chris, have you done any midnight surveillances lately?
I have not. And I get a funny story. I mean, so talking about witness credibility, sort of outside of my normal practice, but I had a case where it was an individual claiming injury and claiming injury from an insurer and representing the insurer, looking to see if the allegations were true, the extent of the injury were true, looking for impeachment evidence, and retained an investigative firm, had an investigator follow the claimant from a court proceeding and got near his house and was claiming a debilitating back injury. And so walked into court with a cane, really, wasn't able to move, wasn't able to sit down, wasn't able to lift arms above the chest, and got off the subway and was getting close to his house, and kid down the street yelled, "Hey, so-and-so," threw the football, and the guy like jumps back and, catches the football. So, just exactly what you were saying, Tom.
Yeah.
Jay, anything to add about?
I think the other guys have covered it pretty well. The only thing I would tell Chris is a lot of times you might be able to go on social media and find the same information these days. So a lot of surveillance investigators are now, surveilling social media. That's a useful tool these days. Yeah, and it's not that we can, we have special powers or, everybody wants access to the special database. It's just that this is what we do. This is our jobs. We do it every day. We're skilled in it. And, just like you can go on WebMD and diagnose yourself, if you have a serious issue, you're probably going to go to the doctor. And maybe if you have a serious need for information, an investigator is a good tool. But obviously what Mary does is a little more specialized in the data analytics world. I still haven't quite figured that out. But that is something that, unless you're trained specifically in data analytics and coding, can be difficult. But maybe she can talk about that a little bit more.
Sure. Obviously, when we're dealing with really large databases, that's not something that you can load into Relativity, and definitely not something that you can, perform high-level, summaries on. So we work with a lot of different data sets at this point that are in the hundreds of millions of rows, maybe even a billion rows. So, that's the sort of thing that you obviously need an analyst for. But we also work with text-based data. So it might be the sort of thing that seems like you can do some advanced searches on. But, a couple of my cases, what you need to know is what's the mix and match of a very particular language within a set of tens of thousands of documents. And that requires, some what's called natural language processing, which is coding to pull out patterns in human created documents. So it's getting computers to understand people. And there's, a lot of different approaches there that really can, faster and maybe, better pull out patterns from big documents that, you really can't have a contract attorney on for, months at a time, maybe a year going through. You can really shorten that process. And sometimes what you need to do is cross-reference identifiers that are only in a document with, information that is in a couple of different databases. So, there's a lot of opportunity for mix and matching very different kinds of data sets. So, think of database exports or Excel files as data, but, you can really turn text into data, and you're going to have to connect those two things. So that's, the sort of, you think that text-based is not data, and we can really turn it into that sort of data analysis.
Thanks, Mary.
I would just from a lawyer perspective, Obviously, Mary, what you just said, I could not possibly do in any kind of a cost-efficient way. And nobody at my firm could do that in a cost-efficient kind of way. But also the other things that we were talking about, the getting impeachment evidence from witnesses, calling potential witnesses, doing the open source data mining, using other databases available. Like, that's all time-intensive work, and it just wouldn't be efficient. It wouldn't be cost-effective to have for my clients to do that myself. And so I think that in addition to the expertise that investigators bring that lawyers don't necessarily have, there's just an economic benefit to retaining investigators to do some of that work.
Yeah, and I think in addition to the skills, the hard skills that we bring, one of our big value adds is we have an extensive knowledge of the kinds of publicly available data sets that are out there that you can use to enrich the sort of documents that you already have. So I really liked your example of the kickbacks, because that data, going back to 2016, I think, if not a little bit earlier, is all publicly available. Yeah, the Center for Medicaid Services, makes it's just a download where they have to report every single payment, from a $12 lunch to a $10,000 dinner. And yeah, that's another value added. We've got this list of what's out there.
Maybe we talk a little bit about kind of the relationship between the attorney and the investigator when we're engaged on cases. I imagine maybe some new associates give us a call, think we just lurk in the shadows for a few weeks, and we come back with a witness or the smoking gun. But talk about the importance of maybe keeping those lines of communication open. Tom, maybe we'll start with you on that.
Yeah, that's exactly right, Matt. We don't just sort of I mean, the most important thing is we understand what the client needs, what they're talking about. If we're talking to Chris, and so we want to get a clear understanding from him, and then we don't just go away and, like you say, come back 2 or 4 weeks later with a report. We like to have a dynamic process where if we get something that's really interesting, we'll contact them right away, give them the information. We'll give updates. We'll send reports. Usually, our first report goes out in the first 10 days or so, and based on that, we'll make recommendations for additional information, because we like to just to help people like Chris manage costs. We'll do it in sort of a tiered way. But yeah, I mean, the communication's critical. We, as Chris also mentioned, his ethical guidelines sort of, attached to our actions, our deeds out there. So even at the outset, we want to understand what the rules are in terms of contacting witnesses, who they are. A lot of times we'll be out there contacting former employees, but we're not going to do it without Chris's approval. And there are certainly some ethical guidelines that go towards that. So yeah, all along the way, we want to be guided by the lawyers. We don't want to, we're not going to go off and in a new direction without their buy-in and their approval. So yeah, it's just a constant and iterative process, and I think that's why we pride ourselves on the relationships we build with the law firms we work with, because they do feel comfortable directing us. They know we'll follow directions. And they look to us for our kind of ideas and expertise.
Jay, any thoughts?
Well, I think, and I think the other guys covered this, but the more context we have on the case, the more we know, probably the more helpful we can be. Sometimes you'll get these calls and the lawyer or other client is very reluctant to share information with you. Obviously, we put confidentiality agreements in place and everything is protected. So there shouldn't be that reluctance. And the more we know about the case, just the more helpful we can be. If we know the reason we're doing a background investigation, there are certain things that we need to look at If I'm looking at an expert witness, it's going to be a different kind of investigation than just a straight up asset investigation or looking at a plaintiff or defendant in a case. So, the more context we have, the more value we can bring. And as Tom said, the iterative process is important as we feed information to Chris and other lawyers. It may influence their case to some extent. They may want to go deeper down a road or a hole that they hadn't thought of before. I've had cases where it sort of changed the direction of the case a bit. Maybe new defendants were added to a case because of things that we found. So it's that two-way communication and process is very important and just allows us to be much more valuable to the process itself.
And I guess maybe I can just chime in. I agree with everything that you guys just said in terms of the benefit of the iterative process in terms of information gathering. The more information I convey to you, the more helpful you're going to be able to be to me, because you're going to know exactly what I'm looking for. You're going to know the types of questions that you should be asking, the types of data sources, Mary, that you might be able to pull that I wouldn't know about. All that's important. But setting that aside, Tom, one thing that you mentioned, which I had mentioned previously, is really the importance of making sure that everybody is clear on the rules of the road, because you really don't want to be in a situation where, the lawyer hasn't appropriately conveyed the ethical requirements that are going to be at play in connection with the particular engagement. The investigator, Tom, gets this great statement from this great former employee, but it turns out that based on the rules in the jurisdiction where the former employee was located, Tom had to say X, Y, and Z at the outset of the interview, and that didn't happen. And then that could lead to problems for the lawyer, problems for the utility of the evidence in connection with the matter. Taking just the example that you mentioned, Tom, of former employees, there are different rules in different jurisdictions about when a lawyer or an investigator for an adversary can approach and speak to a former employee of a represented party. In New York, for example, it's pretty much fair game. Former employees are basically fair game, even if the employer is represented. There are nuances and that apply, however, in places like Florida and New Jersey. So you really have to be cognizant of what the investigator is doing, where the investigator is doing it, and make sure that appropriate guidance has been given.
Thanks, Chris. And before I move on to the next question, just reminding the audience, if you have any questions, feel free to type them in the chat box or the question box. I've not planted any staff members in the audience to ask any softball questions, so I'm relying on the attendees. I know we have a few investigators out there, so feel free to ask away. And Tom, I want to ask you kind of, in your experience, how has investigations changed over the years? I mean, when you think of the old school investigator, you think about a couple guys in a car drinking coffee and smoking cigarettes on this, on a surveillance mission. But how has technology really kind of changed the game over the years?
Well, yeah, it's like any other industry. I mean, technology's just been a game changer for us. And I can just sort of give you an example of the way it was in the old days for me. After I graduated from that all-inclusive resort on a Marine base, Quantico, called the FBI Academy, they just send you out in the field and you have to sort of learn the investigations business, and with a trained agent, that kind of thing. But, I found myself when I was working money laundering and labor racketeering in upstate New York and then later in California, I was surprised by how much time I had to spend in the courthouse, in the newspaper morgues, going to the the county recorder's office, trying to piece together all this disparate information to build a profile of a subject. Looking at, who do they work with, who are people that I may be able to approach as witnesses, what's their financial profile, do they own a bunch of property, do they have businesses? An example of that is if I wanted to do a corporate records check, I had to send a lead to either Albany or Sacramento out here in California. And I was promised a 2-week turnaround. So then you get those records and now you say, oh, there's an officer I'd like to find out more about. So then you can send it back to Sacramento. So obviously, and then, you know, you also did a lot of time on surveillance. Things you can get on Zillow today, you know exactly what a person's house looks like. You get the, you know, satellite shot. We had to go out there on the street. We'd do drive-bys. If we were lucky, we'd get a photo of a person. Today, obviously, I mean, all that's changed. It continues to change to, you know, from being able to access all that stuff from your desktop. I'd say we can get 80% of the information where we need a typical subject, background information, you know, again, a background profile, financial profile, where do they live, who are their family members, just find out everything. You throw in social media, you'll have a picture of them and their family, and you'll probably know the name of their golden retriever. But none of that was available 30 years ago. And then you can kind of fast forward to what Meredith is doing, which just is really scary. I mean, it's just amazing how much data is out there. And then the trick is having the ability to capture it the way Meredith can and analyze it and make it usable. So yeah, things have changed a little bit, including the color of my hair, by the way.
Very distinguished. Chris, any thoughts on your end from, you know, coming from the government side originally and now in private sector and how technology has changed things?
There's just so much more information available. Social media. I mean, I can't tell you how many cases that I've had where the case has turned on something that somebody said on social media, a document that was posted, a picture that was posted, you know, both helpful and unhelpful for my clients at times. But there really is just so much information out there. And then sort of going back to where we were a few minutes ago, which is, you know, what are the best ways for me to get a hold of what's out there? What are the most efficient ways for me to get that information? And, you know, oftentimes it's not me sitting at my computer trolling social media. You know, it's retaining folks like you guys to see what's out there after I tell you the type of case I have, the type of thing I need, the type of thing that might be found, and then have at it and see what comes back. But also do that on the defensive side. You know, I've got a client who I know is being investigated for X. And so let me make sure I understand what's out there, because, you know, I need to assume that my adversary, whether it's on the private side or the government side, is going to be mining all that information just like I would be if I was in their shoes.
Sure. Thanks. And Mary, as Tom and Chris touched on, you have all this data out there. It could be sometimes overwhelming. I know it goes over my head. I know for some, you know, attorneys and counsel we work with, it's hard just to get a sense of what's out there, what I should request, and how to make sense of it. Can you just tell us how you work with, you know, our clients in terms of just not even analyzing the data, but knowing what to request and what to look for?
Yeah, sure. You know, I mentioned sometimes it's easiest for us to do our job if we can have the conversation really on in the discovery process. So we don't expect attorneys to know how, you know, what data types to ask for, what file types to ask for, how to do compression. You know, and if we can work that out in the discovery process early on, it actually does make a big difference. As far as, you know, our work goes, this might sound counterintuitive, but more is often better. That's not universally true, but, you know, getting a download of the full database, asking for a output of every single table, not filtered, into, you know, what's called a flat file, and just giving us all of that. Because for us, hundreds of millions of rows isn't a big deal. But finding out that data is missing, or that important columns that are needed to connect two different pieces of data sets. Actually, oops, they forgot to, include that in the export. That can mean a huge cost in terms of arguing to get things reproduced, and us having to redo our work and understand the data sets differently. Also, knowing how to ask for what's called a data dictionary. So that basically describes every single field that is, in an Excel file or in a database, what it means, what kind of data is in there. So is it a number? Is it long text? Is it just a code? So that we can load things quicker and know what kind of errors we might run into. Getting a confirmation of how many rows we should expect once we've loaded it, because something might pass the sanity test of we think we've gotten all of the data loaded, we think we have all of the files if it's produced in multiple files, and we got 300 gigs, we got 330 rows. That sounds about right. And we won't be able to know necessarily if we missed 10 million rows. So getting that sort of like ways to check that opposing counsel has given you what they think that they have given you, and that they've given it to you in a format that is actually usable, and the first time, and not having to have a fight the second time around or pay us to do the same work second time around.
Sorry. And how do you know when you're getting data from during the discovery process, how do you know what then public available data sets to look at to kind of overlay that and find patterns?
Yeah, it's definitely important to look at what's been produced first, because we need to know what we can even join on, right? So if we have no addresses in a data set, it's going to be a lot harder to connect doctors who are listed in a file with their spending, right? Unless they have an extraordinarily unique name. I'm trying to think of other examples. Conversations with attorneys are really important, because there are times that we come up with these ideas about what is interesting, what might be connected, and before we go deep, we've learned to talk to Chris and say, hey, we think that this could be really interesting, or we could do this kind of analysis. And it comes back and say, yeah, that's interesting. That doesn't actually support the theory of this case, because I don't know what statute, what that you're bringing this on, and I don't know, what you've already written in your brief about what your claims are. So that's really crucial before we go down and start pulling, different kinds of data sets and loading them and connecting them.
And it's not just the analysis too. Certainly it's on me if I don't tell you enough about my case that what you should be analyzing, but also just even in terms of what I am going to want down the road. It's important to have that dialogue early on, particularly where I'm getting the information, when I'm making the requests of the other side, that I'm then going to have you analyze the data, so that you've just explained a whole lot just during this webinar, and so I'm convinced that you can just run magic with data. But in my head, I'm convinced you can run magic with data. But I need to make sure that I have, if I'm requesting multiple data sets, they include what you're talking about. They include the types of information that will allow you to link up one data set from another, so that you can match the doctors and their spending in one Excel file with the locations of the restaurants associated with that spending in a separate Excel spreadsheet. And if we don't have some commonality in the two spreadsheets, you won't be able to do that. I'll think I'm getting this great information, you're just going to splice it together, and then I finished my discovery process, and you tell me you can't do what I assumed you could do. So really the dialogue is key.
Yeah, and we're always happy to review interrogatories or discovery requests and give our 2 cents, because sometimes, yeah, really small changes to requests can make an enormous difference.
Hey, Matt, just one follow on to what Chris and Mary are talking about there. I just wanted to emphasize that the combination of the investigators and the data analytics is pretty powerful too. They're talking about this example of doctors and kickbacks, and the work that Mary and Lacey and the whole team can do around the data might make the investigation much more efficient. So in other words, by doing the analytics up front, they'll see which doctors wrote the most scripts over what period of time and how many events they attended, et cetera. And that's going to be among the priorities of people that we want to talk to. So by using the data analytics, we're making our work more efficient and targeted, and we're not talking to witnesses that perhaps have no relevance. So the combination of those two, we could probably give you 10 different examples in different scenarios, but it's a great combination. And obviously technology and the data is amazing. One thing with Mary's team is, the size of the data is not that important. Once they've written a code and started doing some analysis, whether it's across 100 lines of data or 100 million, it almost doesn't matter at that point. So just the amount of, analysis they can do in a short time is just amazing. And the combination of the two disciplines is a great 1-2 punch.
Sure. Here we have a question from the audience here about overseas investigations and the challenges there. Because obviously we live in a globalized world and cases, cross borders. Maybe we'll start with Tom on this one, kind of directed at the group. Just talk about your experience working on overseas investigations, particularly in countries maybe where it's hard to identify information, particularly from a public record standpoint.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, but I would say there's much more public record information online now, even in developing countries. But it really depends on where you're working. I mean, Asia, Latin America, European continent, and even beyond. It's all pretty specific. So we work with and through partners that we've known for years, that we've worked with for years. I mean, obviously, Gryphon has an office in London, and that's a good place to be, especially for the continent. But yeah, a lot of it is on the ground. It's kind of like, going back to where we were in this country 30 years ago, 20 years ago. You have to go into the agency, you have to request a document. It's bureaucratic. Sometimes the court archives are only open the second Tuesday of the month, something like that. So yeah, it's hit and miss. It's very country specific. And then other countries, everything's online. Some countries in Latin America, we used to say that, like nothing is public, but everything is available. And I'm not talking about doing anything illegal or shady to get the information, but you just had to know the right person to ask. And you have to be very careful. We came up with this issue a couple of years ago in the Philippines, where we were trying to get some information out of their Environmental Protection Agency. And we literally had to network our way to the head of the agency to get that information. It's that bureaucratic, and everybody's protective, and everybody's afraid to release information without authorization.
One thing that you said, Tom, that really resonated is the relationship piece. I mean, I know Gryphon has relationships with folks in lots of different overseas places, and I found that those types of relationships are key. I was trying to serve a subpoena on somebody in a foreign country in a particular location, and was able to leverage those types of relationships, the person on the ground in that foreign country, in that particular city where the person I was trying to serve worked, said, oh, they work there, everybody goes to this place for lunch. If we just sit outside this place for a day or two, we'll see him. It was true. He went there for lunch.
That's great. Yeah. I mean, another example of that is we were doing some pro bono work for some firms out here, and they're immigration cases. And in order, oftentimes you need to produce a birth certificate of, somebody who's maybe 17 years old now, but was born in Central America. So we've had to go into some of these towns and the records are never available, or, so we've actually gone in and gotten declarations from the pastor of the parish, the local parish, and things like that, in order to prove that that person was born there. So, I mean, it's so different, and no matter where you go, and it's really tough sledding in some places. That particular case went on for about 3 or 4 months before we were able to get some resolution to that one.
Jay, any crazy stories from overseas cases?
Oh, probably too many for this time frame that we have. You mean work or okay? No, but something I would add to that. I mean, certainly it's great that, we have relationships with a lot of people, and you need people on the ground that have that local knowledge. But the industry has changed quite a bit over the last 10 years, and a lot of records have gone online. 10 years ago, you'd have to have a person on the ground in every location. Now, as long as we have analysts that speak the language, can read the language and know the court systems and other records repositories, we can be much more effective, both time-wise and cost-effective in terms of gathering information that, 10 years ago would have taken many weeks and several $1,000s. We can do it a lot more efficiently now. So, we have about 30 languages in-house, and we're constantly looking for ways to do more from our desktops here, as opposed to having to use people on the ground. But there are times where you absolutely need that local knowledge and local connections. So just some perspective. Lacey, I'm sorry, I keep calling you Lacey, Mary. Mary, is the data, does the data matter? Aside from language differences, internationally speaking, is data?
You took my question, Jay. My next one.
I mean, if you're talking about publicly available data, it varies wildly from country to country. And there's pressure actually internationally for governments to publish data. And you can be surprised sometimes who's really good about it. Kenya has an open data portal. Who would have expected that? But encoding and language differences can make your life pretty challenging. So if you do need to do translation, you might need to use, some extra tools to do that. But the wonderful thing about data science is it just keeps on getting faster and easier. And there's more tools out there. There's more data. There's, people are just solving for these kinds of problems all the time. You need to make the time to learn all of these new tools. And that can be, sometimes a challenge in our very fast-paced schedule. But it's all about finding better tools and digging very deep into the internet. But I like to joke that I got a master's degree in Google, not in data science. So it's one of my specialties.
Last call for questions, if there's anything out there. I think we just had that one. Maybe I'll throw in one final one, just maybe talking about kind of the limitations as well of what investigators can and cannot find. I mean, we often get asked, oh, we know there's a fraud being committed. I know they're putting in a shell company in the BVIs or wherever, but I mean, obviously we can't just go and get access to bank records. I mean, maybe Tommy could talk a little bit about, limitations there and, certainly managing expectations on that end.
Well, that's the biggest thing. I think, we've all watched television, and I used to do a lot of work, and still do, with the entertainment business. And it always amazed me how entertainment executives think that you can do the sort of things that, you can get the satellite imaging and find out who's in a building or whatever it is that you see on 24. But no, I think that's really important at the outset. And that's where, again, it's very case specific, and we want to understand what the goals are, what the expectations are. But then an important sort of responsibility for investigators is to be very honest about yeah, in some cases, we may be able to get something in that regard, but yeah, there are just people sometimes ask for information that's either not, we just can't acquire it, or we can't acquire it for a reasonable budget, which always comes into play too.
Absolutely.
Jay, do you find that?
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, and transparency about what we can and can't do, is paramount. It is also interesting, kind of goes back to what I was saying before about context. If we know sort of what the end goal of the case is, sometimes we can make recommendations about other sorts of information that may, fill that same purpose. So again, working with the lawyers to really understand the context and what the end goal is, in many cases we can make recommendations. Maybe you can't get, bank records in a certain jurisdiction. We can't get bank records at all, but perhaps there are witnesses that can provide information on, asset levels. There may be other records, property records, or, judgments and liens that provide information relevant to banks that the individual's done business with. So there's always ways, if you get creative, to get good information. But it takes some back and forth and some thinking about the case for sure.
Great. Well, I think we're down to a couple minutes. Any final thoughts for you guys before we close it up? Well, thanks everyone. And real quick, just on the housekeeping side of things, if you've tuned in and for CLE credit, to fill out the evaluation and the affirmation and send that to Chris's colleague, Megan Siegel at Morvillo Abramowitz, her email is listed on those sheets. We'll send along some course documents from this following this, and we'll send out an email and we'll connect everyone. And we'll, if you don't mind, guys, we'll give out Tom, Jay, Mary's, and Chris's email address if you have any follow-up questions or want to just continue the conversation. And once again, thank you all, and thank you to the panelists. You guys were fantastic, and thanks to our audience for tuning in. And have a great rest of the week and a happy Thanksgiving, everybody.
That's good.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye.